Bitcoin once again is pushing up towards the $44,000, and the question is, can it hold this area, and is it able to rally from here into new yearly highs? In today's video, we're going to be jumping down onto the on-chain analytics for Bitcoin, sharing my thoughts and opinions on what this data means and where I think Bitcoin could be heading in the short to medium term. Let's roll that intro and get Okay guys, so Bitcoin obviously has been pushing up towards the kind of mid to high $44,000 levels, just breaching up into 44k at the moment. Now this has obviously spurred on some liquidation events for BTC. We've seen over $52 million in the last 24 hours completely wiped out. This isn't anything too unusual. It's actually quite well within its kind of usual mean in terms of the average of where it normally ends up in terms of liquidation. So it's not anything too much to be too worried about, but it is interesting when we actually dive down into the positions that were liquidated. For example, it was only really a few days ago I was sat here telling you very similar numbers, in fact $40 million of liquidations, and the long positions being wiped out. I think it was 82% of positions wiped out were long positions. Well, today we actually have the opposite. We have 71.67% of the short positions being wiped out as Bitcoin pushed up towards $44,000 and as it breached just up into that lower end. So it's interesting to see how what we found in the last kind of few weeks or so is just liquidations after liquidations. And market makers love to do this. They love to push the price down, liquidate in the longs, and as soon as that happens and people are confident in kind of layering in their short positions, price bounces right the way back up and takes those short positions and liquidates those too. Essentially all money flowing in one direction. It's kind of sad really. But nonetheless, the markets behave this way so much you can be very predictive over where you think things are going based on the common behaviors that you see time and time again. So after seeing $52.5 million of liquidations, 71.67% being short positions wiped out, 28.33% were long positions, which begs the questions, what are those people doing? As price pushed up towards $44,000, how do you get your long positions wiped out unless you really are trying to go long right at the very top and you see a reversal with a very tight stop loss? Or you're just using way too much leverage and getting yourself into a very tricky position. Always make sure you understand the risk management when you use leverage-based trading, because otherwise you'll end up like one of my stats here and be in the liquidation pot. Ultimately, 52.5 million in liquidations isn't too bad. There's definitely been a lot worse out there. FTX is a very clear example of how bad things can get. So Binance does take the top of the list in terms of liquidations. $19.9 million of liquidations sit there at Binance. Now, Binance obviously has had some trouble in the recent kind of weeks, specifically with, the SEC and CZ stepping down, all that kind of stuff. Lots of speculations and rumors flying around of how Binance are kind of done. And I apologize for the wind, guys. It is very, very windy here today, but ultimately, they are still the biggest exchange in terms of volume of what is being pushed through. So it's really hard to think that Binance is just going to disappear overnight, and they still take a very large chunk of the pie. Essentially $19.9 million of liquidations out of the 52 million sit with Binance. Now with that represents 37.92% of all liquidations. Very interesting stuff. OKX is in second position, coming in at $13 million of liquidations. Nothing terribly too unusual with that. OKX for the most part has most recently actually been up in the higher range, kind of topping out at the first place or second place quite consistently for quite some time. But yeah, as we can see, third place obviously comes in at 𝗕𝗘𝗪𝗀 as well. And yeah, liquidations, they are what they are. But the main purpose of today's video is going to be discussing the other analytics, the other interesting data points that I think retail investors are just simply overlooking. And it kind of scares me that people aren't paying more attention to this. Okay, so let's start with the really large wallets, not massive, massive players like MicroStrategy, but really big investors in Bitcoin. So they hold a minimum of 10,000 Bitcoin. They can have more than 10,000, so you can kind of argue that MicroStrategy is included in this stat, but you can actually take a look at their wallets separately. But for the most part, anybody who has more than 10,000 Bitcoin, they fall into this bracket when it comes to statistics. So wallets with more than 10,000 Bitcoin have jumped up 1.9% in the last 7 days. That sounds really good, right? Until you realize there's not really that many wallets, and essentially we're talking about moving up one additional wallet that has more than 10,000 Bitcoin in it, right? So pretty sizable amount of BTC. It is up 1.9% in the last 7 days. Sounds fantastic. Until you zoom out. When you zoom out, you actually realize that they still remain down 6.96% since this time last year. So since the FTX crash, these particular participants that have more than 10,000 Bitcoin have dropped nearly 7%. That's a pretty alarming stat. Yes, they bought up a little bit in the last 7 days, but they haven't really been backing the rest of 2023. You can argue that, in fact, during 2023, it's been nothing but exit liquidity for these billionaires. And so we want to kind of be really aware that the stats on-chain for people who had more than 10,000 Bitcoin is down nearly 7% since this time last year, since the FTX crash, and that's a pretty alarming thing. So if though you might want to focus in on just what's happened in the last 7 days, it looks positive. On a bigger macro picture, they haven't been positive to Bitcoin during the entire year. If we go down a little bit lower, we can take a look at the standard Bitcoin whales. Right, they've not been as strong recently. They're actually down 0.25% in the last 7 days and down 0.83% since this time last year. So essentially, Bitcoin whales, 1,000 Bitcoin or more per wallet, they're not showing any form of growth whatsoever in 2023. So very similar to those that had 10,000 Bitcoin, your 1,000 Bitcoin holders remain exactly the same way. Essentially, they look at 2023 and they've said, hold my beer, I will just be waiting until we see bigger corrections, or maybe they're just not interested in Bitcoin anymore, right? We don't know the rationale or the logic behind it, but the stats are very clear. They haven't been backing the move of Bitcoin to the upside during 2023. It has just been exit liquidity for a few players and a few participants. Now, don't get me wrong, we have seen maybe a few new whales coming in and a few older whales leaving the space. That's a possibility, but it's very flat. It doesn't show any growth. And if we're not seeing growth at the larger institutional level, 1,000 Bitcoin or more, then really what's the growth in Bitcoin at that point? And well, you can go down deeper than that. If you take a look at the retail investors that hold 1 Bitcoin or more, they are actually showing that the growth of 0.21% in the last 7 days. So they've been buying the Bitcoin that the whales were selling, essentially. And if you take a look since this time last year, they're up 5.01%. And so I wanted to put a video out here to kind of reiterate everything that I've been talking about for the last 12 months, maybe even 18 months, that essentially what we've been witnessing so far, realistically speaking, retail investors buying Bitcoin, surplus Bitcoin. And a lot of Bitcoin does sit now at the retail layer. And that is quite concerning to me because retail investors don't usually act logically, they act emotionally. Now this leads to a couple of problems that I have in the space, specifically for Bitcoin and of course the crypto market generally, right? And that is going to be that if retail investors start to panic sell, and because they're acting emotionally, could be a black swan event or whatever, we could see a cascading issue with Bitcoin selling pressure, basically meaning that the supply of BTC floods the market and drags the price of Bitcoin down. And it doesn't even have to be a significant amount of the volume of retail investors. 20 to 30% of retail investors could potentially cause a catastrophic sell-off event for BTC. And if it's not being backed by the whales or larger institutional investors, 10,000 Bitcoin or more, then we could be finding ourselves retesting some lows that a lot of retail investors never thought that would actually see those prices once again. And so if you follow the Bitcoin video updates that I put out in the mornings, you know the kind of levels that I'm talking about here. Ultimately, we're talking, 26 to 28K, we're talking 19 to 21. These are the key areas where we could see a catastrophic sell-off towards, should there be a reason for these retail investors to no longer hold their Bitcoin. And guys, just kind of put this into clarity for you guys. I'm expecting somewhere between 20 and 30% of retail investors to start to get very nervous as we kind of enter into 2024. And that could equate to about 3 to 3.5 million BTC becoming available for sale. Now, we already know that the volume profiles are very low, as in there's not a lot of demand coming into the markets right now. We can see this not only on-chain, but also through the various different exchanges with the volume profiles. In comparison to previous bullish markets, we just do not see anywhere near the kind of volumes that you would expect for a bull market. And so, without demand to soak up about 3 to 3.5 million Bitcoin, there's only one direction that the price action is likely to go in, and that's unfortunately south and potentially very fast. Now, that's the bearish case, right? We obviously do have a lot of bullish things to kind of think about as well that could potentially take BTC up to those interesting areas that everyone's kind of looking for. Those would, of course, be, the ETF, spot ETF news and approvals, all the way through to the Bitcoin halving events. Yet, we haven't seen these materialize, and they could potentially be the black swan event that everyone fears. Ultimately, I'm going to leave the video there though, guys. If you have found it useful and informative, smash that like button. I do appreciate that. If you're new to the channel, subscribe, tap the bell, select all the notifications, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Take care.